If you're constantly drained, doubting yourself, or stuck in the same negative cycles, the truth is, the people around you are the reason. Every unnecessary worry, every second guess, every moment of hesitation, it's being fed by those who silently dictate your thoughts, whether you realize it or not. And most of you are letting them stay. You allow these voices to linger in your life, thinking it's harmless, or I can handle it. But here's the harsh reality: you can't. Not without suffering the slow erosion of your focus, confidence, and inner strength. Before you scroll past this, I need you to stop. Look inward for a moment. Ask yourself, who in my life leaves me feeling small, anxious, or distracted? Who drains my energy without giving anything back? Because if you don't confront this now, if you don't act immediately, you'll keep repeating the same mistakes without even realizing it. You'll keep tolerating the negativity, the subtle manipulations, the endless distractions, and they will quietly steal years of your life. This isn't fear-mongering. This is reality. The people you allow near your mind shape your destiny. And right now, many of you are unconsciously giving your power away. If you want to reclaim control, if you want clarity, strength, and discipline, you need to see this truth, accept it, and act on it. That's why you need to subscribe to this channel. Because the knowledge you're about to gain could be the difference between stagnation and mastery, between mental chaos and peace. Don't wait. Your life depends on who you choose to let in. Stoicism teaches us something most people spend their entire lives resisting. The external world does not control our inner peace. Events, circumstances, opinions, and outcomes exist outside our command. What remains within our command is the mind, our judgments, our responses, our discipline. This distinction is not abstract philosophy. It is a survival principle. And yet, despite knowing this, many people unknowingly surrender that control every single day through the people they allow close to them. Human beings are social by nature. We absorb language, habits, attitudes, and emotional patterns from those we spend time with. This happens quietly, without announcement. A dismissive comment here. A doubtful reaction there. A constant tone of complaint, fear, or resentment. Over time, these influences begin to shape how we think, how we interpret events, and how we see ourselves. Not because we are weak, but because exposure creates familiarity, and familiarity creates acceptance. The Stoics understood this deeply. They knew that while you cannot command the behavior of others, you can choose proximity. You can decide who has access to your attention, your time, and your emotional energy. When this choice is neglected, the cost is paid internally. Discipline weakens because distractions increase. Patience erodes because emotional friction becomes constant. Clarity fades because your mind is forced to process noise that does not serve your values. The danger is not always obvious. The wrong associations are rarely dramatic. They don't always arrive as conflict or betrayal. More often, they arrive as tolerance. You tolerate negativity because it feels familiar. You tolerate disrespect because it is subtle. You tolerate stagnation because everyone around you accepts it as normal. Slowly, your standards lower, not by decision, but by exposure. Stoicism does not teach withdrawal from humanity. It teaches selectiveness. It teaches that character is shaped through repeated contact. That the mind takes form from what it repeatedly entertains. When you allow people who lack self-control, responsibility, or purpose to occupy your space, your mind is constantly forced to defend itself. That defense consumes energy that should be directed toward growth, mastery, and calm. Marcus Aurelius warned that the soul becomes dyed by the color of its thoughts. What he did not need to explain is where many of those thoughts come from: conversation, environment, and association. The voices you hear most often become the ones you begin to answer internally. This is why so many people feel exhausted without understanding why. Their minds are never at rest because they are constantly reacting to external influence. This is not about judging others. It is about protecting yourself. Stoicism is a philosophy of responsibility, and responsibility begins with awareness. Once you understand that your inner state is being shaped daily by those around you, neutrality is no longer an option. You either choose your circle deliberately, or your circle chooses your future for you. That is why this topic matters. Not tomorrow, not later, now. Because reclaiming your life does not start with changing the world. It starts with removing what quietly pulls you away from who you are trying to become. And to do that, you must first see clearly. Today, we are going to expose the 10 types of people who undermine discipline, weaken resolve, and keep you stuck, so you can finally take back control of your mind, your direction, and your life. The central Stoic principle here is simple, but uncompromising. Control what you can, and accept what you cannot. This idea is not about passive acceptance or emotional detachment. It is about precision. The Stoics understood that wasting energy on what lies outside your control weakens the mind and fractures focus. The world will remain unpredictable. People will behave according to their nature. Circumstances will shift without your permission. None of that is yours to command. What is yours to command is access. Access to your attention. Access to your time. Access to your emotional space. Every person you allow close to you occupies a portion of your mental environment. They influence how you think, how you react, and how you interpret events, whether you notice it or not. This is why Stoicism places such importance on judgment. Not judgment of others, but judgment of what you allow to shape you. When you tolerate people who disrupt your focus, you train your mind to accept distraction. When you remain close to those who lack discipline, your own standards begin to soften. When you stay around emotional chaos, tranquility becomes harder to maintain. None of this happens suddenly. It happens through repetition, through exposure, through silence. Removing what weakens your virtue is not cruelty. It is self-command. It is the deliberate act of preserving clarity, discipline, and calm in a world that constantly competes for your attention. This is not about cutting people out impulsively. It is about recognizing patterns and responding with reason rather than emotion. Once you understand this principle, everything changes. You stop trying to fix people. You stop absorbing unnecessary tension. You stop negotiating with influences that quietly pull you away from who you are trying to become. And with that clarity, you are finally ready to identify the 10 types of people who silently drain your energy, not to condemn them, but to remove their influence from your life. 1. The constant complainer. The constant complainer sees obstacles where discipline demands action. Nothing is ever right. Every situation is unfair. Every responsibility is a burden. At first, this may appear harmless, even relatable. But over time, this mindset reshapes how you interpret reality. You begin to expect resistance instead of responsibility. Stoicism teaches that suffering is not found in circumstance, but in judgment. When you remain close to those who endlessly complain, you slowly train your mind to fixate on what is wrong rather than what is within your control. This weakens resolve and replaces action with excuse. A Stoic does not deny difficulty, but refuses to live inside it. 2. The manipulator. The manipulator operates through emotional leverage rather than truth. They twist conversations, reframe facts, and use guilt as currency. You leave interactions with them feeling confused, obligated, or subtly at fault, even when reason says otherwise. Stoicism values clarity above comfort, integrity above approval. When you tolerate manipulation, you teach your mind to distrust its own judgment. Over time, this erodes self-command. Virtue does not bend to emotional pressure. A disciplined mind recognizes manipulation not through anger, but through distance. 3. The energy vampire. The energy vampire consumes without contributing. They require constant reassurance, validation, or attention, yet offer little respect, accountability, or reciprocity. After time spent with them, you feel mentally fatigued, unfocused, and irritable, not because of effort, but because of imbalance. Stoicism reminds us that energy is finite. Attention is valuable. To waste it carelessly is a failure of discipline. Protecting your energy is not selfish. It is necessary for clarity and purpose. 4. The envious peer. The envious peer applauds quietly and resents loudly, often without words. Your progress unsettles them. Your growth reminds them of what they have avoided. Instead of self-reflection, they choose comparison. Stoicism teaches tolerance, not proximity. You do not need to confront envy, explain success, or minimize achievement. Distance preserves peace. Marcus Aurelius warned against allowing another's resentment to disturb inner calm. Envy does not disappear through explanation. It fades through separation. 5. The perpetual victim. The perpetual victim never accepts responsibility. Everything happens to them. Nothing happens because of them. Their stories are filled with blame, injustice, and resignation. Prolonged exposure to this mindset subtly infects your own thinking. You begin to see obstacles as fate rather than feedback. Stoicism is built on personal responsibility. To stay near those who reject responsibility is to weaken your own sense of agency. A Stoic does not deny hardship, but never surrenders authorship of their life. 6. The distractor. The distractor thrives on noise. Drama, gossip, endless urgency. Nothing is ever calm. Nothing is ever resolved. They pull attention away from what matters and scatter focus across meaningless stimuli. Stoicism treats focus as a form of respect for time, effort, and purpose. When you allow distraction to dominate your environment, discipline decays. Great progress requires silence, repetition, and restraint. Protecting your focus is an act of self-respect. 7. The disloyal friend. The disloyal friend is present when convenient and absent when inconvenient. They share selectively, defend inconsistently, and disappear when integrity is required. Trust is the foundation of character. Without it, every interaction becomes calculation. Stoicism values reliability over charm. A disloyal presence creates constant uncertainty, which exhausts the mind. Peace requires knowing where you stand. When loyalty is missing, stability collapses, and no philosophy can compensate for that. 8. The chronic liar. The chronic liar erodes reality itself. Conversations feel unstable. Facts shift. Truth becomes negotiable. Over time, this forces your mind into constant vigilance, draining mental clarity. Stoicism depends on truth as a stabilizing force. A sound mind requires a stable framework of reality. Lies introduce friction, suspicion, and confusion. Distance from dishonesty is not moral arrogance. It is psychological hygiene. 9. The opportunist. The opportunist appears only when advantage is available. Their interest aligns with benefit, not respect. When you serve no purpose, they vanish. This relationship conditions you to associate worth with usefulness rather than character. Stoicism teaches inherent dignity, value grounded in virtue, not transaction. Remaining close to opportunism trains the mind to accept conditional respect. Your circle should reflect principle, not convenience. 10. The cynic. The cynic mocks effort, dismisses ambition, and belittles hope. Not through confrontation, but through sarcasm and detachment. They frame disengagement as intelligence and apathy as wisdom. Over time, this corrodes motivation. Stoicism does not reject hope, it rejects illusion. Growth requires belief in effort, discipline, and progress. Those who poison outlook undermine momentum. Avoiding cynicism is not naivete, it is mental preservation. Human beings are not isolated minds. We are responsive systems, shaped continuously by our environment. Long before conscious thought intervenes, the brain absorbs emotional cues, attitudes, and behavioral patterns from those nearby. Tone influences mood. Repetition influences belief. Proximity influences identity. This is not weakness. It is how the human nervous system evolved to survive. Psychologically, the mind is designed to conserve energy. It looks for patterns, shortcuts, and norms. When negativity becomes common in your environment, the brain stops treating it as a warning and begins treating it as baseline reality. Complaints feel normal. Distraction feels justified. Emotional volatility feels expected. Over time, your internal dialogue begins to mirror what surrounds you. This is why negativity spreads. Not because people choose it deliberately, but because repeated exposure lowers resistance. The brain adapts to what it encounters most often. If criticism dominates conversation, self-doubt increases. If irresponsibility is excused, discipline weakens. If resentment is normalized, emotional resilience declines. Self-esteem is particularly vulnerable to this process. Confidence is not built through affirmation alone. It is built through consistent reinforcement of agency and competence. When you remain close to people who dismiss effort, mock progress, or externalize blame, your sense of control quietly erodes. You may still understand what needs to be done, but your belief in your ability to do it begins to fade. Emotional regulation also suffers. The mind becomes reactive rather than deliberate. Small frustrations feel heavier. Focus becomes fragile. Motivation fluctuates. This is not because you lack strength, but because your environment is constantly pulling your nervous system into unnecessary alertness. Discipline requires psychological stability. It requires a mind that is not constantly defending itself from emotional interference. When toxic influences remain close, attention is fragmented. Energy is diverted. Mental clarity becomes harder to sustain, not through crisis, but through constant low-level disturbance. The most dangerous part is that this surrender of control feels gradual and unremarkable. There is no clear moment where you decide to lose discipline. It happens through tolerance, through staying, through telling yourself it doesn't matter. But psychologically, it always matters. What you repeatedly expose your mind to becomes part of how it operates. And once your internal state is shaped by external influence, peace becomes something you chase instead of something you maintain. Epictetus advised, "Keep the company of those who will make a better man of you." This was not moral idealism. It was practical discipline. The Stoics understood that character is not forged in isolation, but refined through interaction. Association is not neutral. It is formative. Stoicism is often misunderstood as withdrawal from others. In truth, it is deliberate engagement. It asks not how many people surround you, but how their presence shapes your judgment. The Stoic does not seek approval, but alignment. He does not seek comfort, but reinforcement of virtue. Virtue, in Stoic philosophy, is not abstract goodness. It is lived consistency, clarity of thought, restraint in emotion, responsibility in action. These qualities are difficult to maintain in environments that reward impulse, excuse weakness, or ridicule discipline. This is why association matters. When you surround yourself with people who respect effort, value responsibility, and speak with intention, discipline becomes easier to sustain. Not because they push you, but because they do not pull you away from your standards. Stoicism does not require you to fix others. It requires you to govern yourself. And self-governance begins with choosing conditions that support reason rather than undermine it. The Stoics were clear. You cannot prevent others from behaving poorly, but you are responsible for how close you stand to it. Proximity creates influence. Influence shapes habit. Habit shapes character. Deliberate association is not arrogance. It is foresight. It recognizes that the mind cannot remain unaffected by what it repeatedly encounters. To protect virtue, you must protect context. Surround yourself with those whose presence reinforces calm rather than agitation. Responsibility rather than excuse. Direction rather than drift. Not because they are perfect, but because they are aligned with who you are trying to become. This is Stoic discipline applied to real life. Not isolation. Not judgment. But choice. Think about your inner circle right now. Not the people you occasionally speak to, but the ones who consistently occupy your time, attention, and emotional space. These are the individuals whose words echo in your mind long after conversations end. These are the people whose reactions shape your self-doubt, whose expectations influence your decisions, and whose attitudes quietly recalibrate what you consider normal. Most people never pause to examine this. They assume relationships are neutral by default. That as long as there is no open conflict, no betrayal, no obvious hostility, everything is fine. Stoicism challenges this assumption. It teaches that neutrality does not exist when it comes to influence. Every relationship either strengthens discipline or weakens it. Every interaction either sharpens clarity or dulls it. The cost of the wrong associations is rarely visible upfront. It doesn't arrive as a single moment of collapse. It arrives gradually. You hesitate where you once acted. You rationalize behavior you once rejected. You feel tired without physical effort. This is the invisible cost, the mental tax paid daily for tolerating what does not align with your values. Once you truly see this cost, your perspective shifts. You stop asking whether someone means well and start observing whether they contribute well. You stop measuring relationships by history and start measuring them by impact. You stop excusing patterns because of familiarity and begin judging them by effect. Detachment, then, is no longer cold or cruel. It becomes rational, necessary. Stoicism does not ask you to hate others or judge them harshly. It asks you to respect yourself enough to withdraw from what diminishes you. The moment you recognize that peace is not fragile, that it is being actively disrupted, tolerance transforms into self-neglect. This shift is uncomfortable because it removes comforting illusions. It forces you to accept that some people you care about may never align with the life you are building. Not because they are evil, but because their presence pulls you in directions you can no longer afford. The Stoic response is not anger. It is clarity. When this perspective takes hold, you no longer feel guilty for choosing distance. You understand that discipline requires separation, that growth demands space, that calm is preserved not by wishing people would change, but by adjusting your proximity to them. At this point, detachment stops feeling like loss. It feels like alignment, like relief, like the quiet return of mental order. And once you see the true cost of allowing the wrong people access to your inner world, you realize that remaining attached is no longer compassionate. It is careless. Stoicism is not a philosophy of confrontation. It is a philosophy of control. And control does not require arguments, explanations, or dramatic exits. It requires boundaries, clear, quiet, and consistent. You do not need to announce your withdrawal. You do not need to justify your distance. You do not need permission to protect your time, your focus, or your emotional stability. Stoic application is subtle. It happens in what you stop engaging with, what you stop reacting to, and where you choose to place your attention. Start by prioritizing your internal state. Notice how you feel after interactions. Not what was said, not what was intended, but how your mind responds afterward. Calm is a signal. Tension is a signal. Fatigue is a signal. Stoicism teaches attentiveness to these internal indicators because they reveal alignment or conflict. Engage more deeply with those who reinforce discipline, accountability, and forward movement. These are the people who speak with clarity, respect boundaries, and value responsibility. They do not need to motivate you. Their presence naturally supports growth. At the same time, reduce exposure to those who feed stagnation. This does not require cutting off communication entirely. Often, subtle distance is enough. Fewer conversations, shorter interactions, less emotional investment. Over time, the mind recalibrates. Peace returns not through force, but through absence of disturbance. Boundaries are not walls. They are filters. They allow what strengthens you to pass through and block what weakens you. Stoicism values restraint because restraint preserves energy for what matters. Every moment you reclaim from unnecessary engagement is a moment redirected toward discipline, reflection, and progress. This application requires consistency, not perfection. There will be moments of doubt, moments of guilt, moments where old habits pull you back. Stoicism does not demand emotional numbness. It demands reasoned choice. When practiced steadily, this approach restores mental clarity. Decisions become simpler. Reactions become calmer. You stop feeling pulled in opposing directions. Your life begins to reflect intention rather than tolerance. Ultimately, the application of this philosophy is not about removing others. It is about reclaiming yourself. About choosing environments that support who you are becoming rather than who you were. And when your inner world is no longer crowded by unnecessary influence, peace stops being something you chase. It becomes something you maintain. If you ignore this advice, the consequences will not arrive loudly. They will not announce themselves as failure. They will arrive quietly, through repetition. The same arguments, the same frustrations, the same sense that time is passing but nothing is changing. This is how stagnation begins, not with collapse, but with comfort in dysfunction. You will find yourself reacting instead of acting, managing emotional fallout instead of building discipline, revisiting the same problems with different words but identical outcomes. Over time, this repetition conditions the mind to expect limitation. Goals that once felt achievable begin to feel distant, not because they are unreachable, but because your environment no longer supports effort. Confidence does not disappear overnight. It erodes through constant exposure to doubt, comparison, and emotional noise. When you remain surrounded by people who normalize distraction, excuse irresponsibility, or resent progress, your standards begin to blur. You stop demanding more, not only from others, but from yourself. Discipline suffers first. Focus becomes fragmented. Motivation becomes inconsistent. You tell yourself you'll regain momentum later, once circumstances improve. But Stoicism is clear. Circumstances rarely improve on their own. What improves is judgment, and judgment cannot remain sharp in a polluted environment. Unchecked, this erosion becomes identity. You begin to see stagnation as realism, tolerance as maturity, withdrawal as wisdom. This is the most dangerous stage, when decline disguises itself as acceptance. At this point, Stoic principles may still sound appealing, but they no longer guide action. Wisdom without application becomes decoration. And that is the true consequence. Philosophy reduced to comfort rather than correction. Insight without discipline. Understanding without change. Stoic wisdom is not meant to be admired. It is meant to be lived. The moment you allow toxic influence to dictate your mental state, the philosophy loses its power. This is not a moral failure. It is a strategic one. You cannot cultivate clarity while surrounded by constant disturbance. You cannot build resolve while absorbing hesitation. You cannot move forward while allowing others to anchor you to patterns you've outgrown. Ignoring this lesson does not keep life the same. It guarantees slow decline. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to remember who you were trying to become in the first place. Cutting ties often feels uncomfortable because the mind confuses familiarity with necessity. Loss feels immediate. Relief arrives later. Stoicism prepares you for this delay. It teaches that discomfort is not proof of error. It is often proof of change. When you remove toxic influence, there is a temporary silence. A space where conversation once existed. A pause where emotional friction used to live. This can feel unsettling at first. But that space is not emptiness. It is capacity. With fewer distractions, the mind begins to settle. Focus sharpens. Decisions require less justification. Emotional reactions soften. You begin to notice how much energy was previously spent managing what never truly mattered. This is liberation, not dramatic, not euphoric, but steady and grounding. Every influence removed restores a portion of your attention. Every boundary reinforces self-command. Slowly, your internal environment becomes ordered. Calm returns not because life becomes easier, but because your mind becomes less divided. Stoicism does not promise happiness. It promises clarity. And clarity brings confidence, the quiet kind. The kind that does not announce itself, but shows up through consistency, restraint, and direction. When your circle aligns with your values, discipline no longer feels like resistance. It feels natural. Growth no longer requires constant motivation. It becomes momentum. Control your circle, and you reduce internal conflict. Reduce internal conflict, and discipline becomes sustainable. This is how control of life is actually achieved, not by dominating circumstances, but by mastering exposure. You do not need approval for this. You do not need validation. You need alignment. And alignment is achieved through deliberate choice. In the end, removing what weakens you is not rejection of others. It is commitment to yourself. A Stoic does not cling to what disturbs peace. He preserves what strengthens it. When your environment supports clarity, tranquility stops being fragile. It becomes stable. And from that stability, a life of purpose, discipline, and self-command naturally follows. The people around you shape your reality more than you realize, not through dramatic moments, but through repetition. Through what they normalize. Through what they tolerate. Through what they expect from you, and what they quietly discourage. Over time, these influences become internal voices. They guide decisions, frame doubts, and define limits, often without your consent. A Stoic understands that life is not mastered by force, but by selection. Selection of thoughts. Selection of habits. Selection of associations. This is why choosing your circle requires the same precision as choosing your principles. What you allow near your mind determines what grows there. Remove what harms your virtue, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Welcome what strengthens discipline, not out of comfort, but out of alignment. When your environment supports self-command, progress stops feeling like resistance and begins to feel natural. There is no sudden moment where everything changes. There is only consistency. Calm decisions repeated daily. Boundaries honored quietly. Attention invested where it returns strength rather than exhaustion. This is how a life moves from disorder to command. Not through noise. Not through reaction. But through steady control of influence. When your inner world is no longer crowded by what weakens you, mastery is no longer something you chase. It becomes the direction you walk. If this message reached you, don't dismiss it. Messages like this only resonate when something inside you already knows it's true. Ignoring that signal means choosing familiarity over growth, and that choice always has a cost. Subscribe to Daily Stoic Vault now, not later. Because discipline delayed becomes discipline denied. The longer you wait, the easier it becomes to return to old patterns, old tolerances, and old compromises. Like this video if you value mental clarity, self-command, and restraint in a world built on distraction. Share it with someone who is trapped in draining relationships but hasn't found the words to step away. And if you're serious about protecting your time, your focus, and your peace, this channel exists for that reason. Don't let another day of wasted energy pass unnoticed. Choose awareness. Choose discipline. Choose control.